All right, so kind of pick up where we left off in module 2. I'll do some newer, a little bit of a review of kind of where we left off and then do some new material. If we have a chance, we'll start module 3. We'll kind of see time-wise where we end up at. I think that the first example I worked through will be a good review of what we did last class and kind of set us up pretty well. So I'll take a little bit of time with that, but I think it'll be beneficial for all of you. So, other than that, some things to mention. So we'll have that participation quiz today, which I'll kind of publish here and we'll kind of look at later on in the class. I'll publish module 2's quiz after we cover the material at the end of class today, and then get that recording kind of posted as well as soon as class is over. I've also got module 3's reading up there. That'll be due before we start class tomorrow, because that's when we will really start covering module 3. Even if we get to start it today, I don't expect that you've kind of done that module reading until tomorrow, okay? But before class tomorrow. Let me make sure I say that. Okay? Any questions for me before we jump into things? Something a couple people reached out. Oh, go ahead.
For the module 2 reading,
Yep.
it says in Top Hat that it was completed, but on Canvas it still says that it's waiting to be submitted.
Okay, I might just have to click a setting so that it should automatically after the due date, which was, it might have some lag time. It should auto sync to Canvas, but I'll make sure that it's syncing the grades up.
Thank you.
As long as you can see it on Top Hat, I'll get it over on Canvas. It should be auto syncing. Like I said, it might be because the due date, the times, the next 5 minutes, if it's still not showing up, I'll take a look at it after class and make sure there's no settings that are kind of prohibiting that.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions before we dive into things here? All right, so let's think about what we were doing last class. So I had, the example that we were looking at with trade, production possibilities curves. I was thinking about this like as an entire worldwide economy with multiple countries, but really you can use the same thought process to understand even like within a company, how individuals' production possibilities curves and then like the company-wide production possibilities curve. So let's do 2 individuals, right? So Sam and Robert. And I'll make this one a little bit specific to my life. And you can maybe see how we can use these economic principles not to just be in the business setting, but individual decision making, right? So I currently have a 7-month-old. So I'm changing a lot of diapers and feeding him a lot, right? So my wife and I, let's think about if we were doing this just on our own, I don't know, every week to use some crazy number. We'll just kind of choose some numbers to make this a little bit easier. So let's do, I don't know, 40. And I don't know, hopefully I don't choose a number where it's like, you're only feeding your baby that much, but we'll just do some numbers to make it kind of easy, right? So 40 and 20, and I don't know, maybe I can do, let's say 60, and we'll do, I'm not as good at this, right? So here we've kind of got this setup where if we're both using all of our resources to do one thing, produce one thing, changing diapers or feeding. Once again, this could be the production of 2 goods, but just to kind of put it in a slightly different context, how could I build out my household production possibilities curve or my economy-wide production possibilities curve? Well, if we looked at both individuals, right, I can kind of say, okay, if I were to draw out both of their production possibilities curves, and I've got, diapers down here, feedings up here. These are my 2 goods that this economy is producing. So for my wife, do what? 40. Oh, I'm looking at this upside down. Or I'm looking at this. I had feedings on the y-axis. So 20 and 40, right? And then if I had my production possibilities curve, I'm at what? 15 and 60. So we didn't have an example, I think, drawn out like this last class, but this, I think, will help show when I want to know who has an absolute advantage, so if I'm thinking about who has an absolute advantage in these two goods, right? It's going to be whoever's intercept is further away from the origin or further away from zero, right? Who can produce more of this good using all of their resources? So the visual is kind of easy to see. Oh, well, who was this? So the red was Robert here. So I would have kind of an absolute advantage in changing diapers while my wife has a higher intercept for feeding. So she would have the absolute advantage there. Right? Now, when it comes to comparative advantage, right, using colors might help if this isn't perfectly clear. I was trying to look at the recordings, and I think it's showing up on the recordings clearer than it is to me on the computer screen. So I apologize for hitting this focus. I sometimes get worried it's not looking as clear. But how do I figure out a comparative advantage? Well, that was the cost, right? Who could do this, produce this good at a lower cost. So if I'm thinking about how can I find costs from this graph, well, remember the x-axis good, the slope of my production possibilities curve tells me the cost of that good. So for Robert, what would the slope be? So change in y over the change in x. So this would be what? Negative 15 over 60. So what? 1/4. Right? And then if I think about what about for Sam, that change in y would be negative 20 over 40 or negative 1/2. So who has the comparative advantage here in the production of that x-axis good? Well, who can do it at a lower cost? It would only cost me the time that I would kind of take to change a diaper as opposed to put towards feeding, a fourth of a feeding. For Sam, my wife, it would be half. Right? So who has the lower cost to kind of producing these diapers? That would be me as well, which automatically, we said I can only have a comparative advantage in one good. So I know that my wife is going to have also a comparative advantage in feeding, right? The production of the other good. Now I can prove this to myself because remember, here, this is the cost, the slope of our x-axis good. If I wanted the cost of my y-axis good, so how would I find the cost of a feeding, which was my y-axis good? Well, for each individual, so I would just take whatever their cost of the x-axis good was and do 1 over that. So 1 over 1/4, 1 over 1/2, and end up with what? 4 and 2. Sure enough, who has the lower cost of the feedings or the y-axis good? That would be Sam, right? So you can have a comparative and an absolute advantage in the same good. It can be in different goods. You don't always have to have one person always having the absolute advantage in both goods. There's all these different possible scenarios that we could look at. Okay. All right. Any questions before I keep moving here? Okay. So using these costs for this y-axis good, I think will make it a little bit easier to then draw out our economy-wide, or in this case, do the negative signs matter? It's a good question. So from last class, we said anytime I calculate the slope, anytime I calculate the slope of my production possibilities curve, it's always negative. When we're talking about costs, essentially we ignore the negative sign because a cost is inherently negative. So even though when you calculate the slope, it's negative, when we talk about the costs, we usually will drop that negative sign. And I'm not going to, on a question, try to trick you where, I'll make sure I even throw in, enter it without the negative sign or something like that if I'm asking about a cost in an example like this. Good question. So once we have the costs, okay, we can then think about, all right, if I can get this all to be on one screen. Let's see. I can't move that. Well, I'll scrap this. Put this up a little bit higher. So let's now, I could keep diapers on the x-axis, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to use these costs, I think, hopefully to kind of make this make a little more sense. So let's say instead, now that I have the costs of the y-axis good, I decide to put that on my x-axis, right? Just because these are a little bit easier to deal with than the fractions. So if I'm looking at my entire household's production possibilities curve, who am I going to rely on to first start feeding my child? Well, who can do it at a lower cost? It's only going to cost Sam 2 diapers. It's going to cost me 4 diaper changings. So we're going to rely on who can do it at the lowest cost first. So what would the total number of diapers, if that's all we were doing is changing diapers, could this economy change? Well, each person putting all their resources, 40 and 60, we would just add those up and we'd be at 100. What if we're only feeding our child? 20, 15, add those up, we would be at 35. So there's certain questions like in the module practice problems for module 2 that might ask which of these points are on the economy-wide production possibilities curve. So you would take both individuals, how much they can produce of each good to find these kind of intercept points. Those are some of the easier ones. Okay, hold on. Light didn't turn off on me. It's supposed to be on for an hour and 15 minutes, but all right. So these are the easier points to find. Now, initially, who am I going to rely on to start feeding our child? My wife, because she can do it at a lower cost. So initially, the slope of my production possibilities curve would be -2. Now, eventually, I get to a point where my wife is using all of her time to feed our child. So she's feeding him 20 times. I'm using all of my resources to just change diapers. So we're both doing what we have a comparative advantage in. So this middle point on our economy-wide production possibilities curve is going to be when both individuals are only producing what they have a comparative advantage in. So I had the comparative advantage in diaper changing, so I'm going to be all my resources there, 60. Her resources towards feeding, we would be at 20, right? Now, if I want to kind of get more of my x-axis good, I'm going to have to now start relying on whoever can produce it at the next lowest cost. Now here I only have 2 people, so it makes it a little bit easier. I'll never give you an example where I ask about what points are on the production possibilities curve with anything other than just 2 people. You could do it. It would just be a little bit more complicated. But here we can definitely do 2. Okay. So these are the 3 points, I think, from the information given that are the easiest to figure out if they're on the curve. So if I were to ask you something like, well, can this economy, right, this household economy, can they have 20 feedings and 40 diaper changes? Well, where would that be? Somewhere down here. What would we say this economy is being from last class? Any point under the curve, we said they were being production inefficient. Can I, maybe a little bit trickier one, can I get 20 feedings? No, not 20. Let's do, let's say, is this next point on the curve? So let's say 25 feedings and I don't know, let's do 50 diaper changes, right? Well, could be, right? Because I guess I have more feedings, I'm gonna have to stop, give up some diaper change production. So I'm not really sure where this point would be at. So how do I check to see if this point is on the curve, underneath, or above? Right? Well, if I move from this point and I want to get 5 additional feedings, who am I relying on? The person that can do it at the second lowest cost, which is 4. So for every feeding from 20 to 25, each one is going to cost me 4 diaper changes. So I'm going to have to give up 20 of that y-axis good. So I'd have to be going from 60 to what? 60 minus 20 would be 40. So the point that's on the curve when this x-axis good is 25 would not be 2550, it would actually be 2540. So that point of 2550, well, it's not drop the scale, would be up here. And we would say this is unattainable. Right? So that's how we can kind of check to see if these different points are on the curve. Any questions on that idea? I'll do one more here. What if I said, is the point take this away here for a second. Let's say, is the point of 10 feedings and I don't know, 80 diaper changes on this curve? Well, it's possible, right? Because if I'm producing less here, I'll be somewhere above 60. But what point is actually on the curve when that x-axis good is 10? Well, if I want to go from 0 to 10 feedings and the x-axis good, how much is each one costing me? 2 diaper changes. So the total cost would be 10 times 2 would be 20. So moving from this point of 0 of the x-axis good to 10, I'd go from 100 minus 20. I would be at that point of 80. So that is a point that is on the curve or production efficient. Right? So this is kind of how I would check to see if different points are on the curve. These three, I think, are the easiest ones to figure out if they're on the curve. The ones in the middle, a little bit trickier. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So we said that in not just a two-person economy, that we're going to have to, the same thought process applies where whatever good is on my x-axis and whatever good is on my y-axis, I am first going to rely on whoever can produce this at the lower cost. So a lower cost in terms of the slope of our production possibilities curve means it's flatter, right? Closer to 0. So initially, I'm going to be relying on people who can produce at a really low cost. Once they use all their resources, the next lowest, and the next lowest, and the next lowest, till eventually I start to get to relying on people who are producing at a really steep slope or a really high cost. So you can kind of think about here, initially for our economy, we can produce this X good at a very low cost. Eventually, we have to start relying on people who can produce it at a higher cost. Okay. All right, so every point on this curve we said is production efficient. But for an economy, I don't want to only have all of one good. Like if I think about this as the choice of the guns and butter example I used last class, like military products versus agricultural products, I don't want to only be producing military products because then my people are starving and they revolt, right? Or I don't want to only be producing agricultural products because then I'm a really weak nation and someone can come in and invade me. So those points, although both production efficient, probably aren't what we call allocatively efficient, right? It's not going to be what maximizes total net benefits for that economy. So how can we determine what point is allocative efficient or where that society would be best off, or where they would prefer to be somewhere in the middle, but where exactly? So the way that we would kind of determine allocative efficiency, and this sets us up a little bit to thinking about module 3, is if I'm thinking about what level of production of this x-axis good will give me the highest net benefits. Remember we said last class, people will choose to consume or produce up to the point where the net benefits are still positive up to where they are exactly 0, right? Where marginal benefits are greater than marginal costs. So what does the slope of my production possibilities curve tell me? It tells me the costs of my x-axis good. What's happening to these costs? That slope is getting steeper. So my marginal costs are getting higher and higher. Now, we said last class, generally, the very first unit you have of a good provides you the highest marginal benefit. If instead I think about this x-axis good being if I go from an economy where I'm only producing agricultural products, that very first, I don't know, military unit is really beneficial, right? Because at least now there's some threat that I can attack you back, right? So that's going to have the highest marginal benefit. Well, then, eventually I add the second. Okay, now I've got a stronger military. Eventually we get to a point where if I start putting more money towards my military, my people start to become hungry, right? The marginal benefit is getting lower and lower. In fact, there could be a point where it could be, if I keep going, producing more and more of these military units, now my people are starving. That's a negative marginal benefit to my people. Now, we'll never get to that point because we only consume as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So where would the allocative efficient point be for the society? Just like for self-interested rational individuals, a self-interested rational economy would produce up to the point where marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit, right? That's our allocative efficient point, okay? And these costs directly come from our production possibilities curve. Now, determining what the marginal benefits are, that's a little bit trickier. We're going to kind of punt on that. We're not necessarily going to dive into where those come from. All we're going to kind of use is we know that marginal benefits will be declining, right? So they initially will start out relatively high and then kind of decrease, okay? Oh, there we go. Move this out of the way here. Nope. So we have been talking about production versus allocated efficiency, right? All those points on the curve are production efficient. However, there's only going to be one point that is allocated efficient where that marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. That's where our economy would stop. So that really hinges on this idea that we have diminishing marginal benefits as we produce or as we consume more and more of something. And I think I changed the example, but if you were looking at songwriting, for our society, I kind of use this example of military units and agricultural products, but it's the same idea no matter what products we're looking at, no matter what two things the individual is doing. We could go back to my example of diaper changes and feedings. Where's the allocated efficient point? Well, we don't want to, production efficient. We could just only be, changing diapers or only feeding. We want to be somewhere in the middle. Where's the best point for our economy where those marginal benefits are equal to the marginal costs? Okay. So we already kind of worked through that. Any questions on that? So it's a little bit of review of kind of what we did last class, adding in this idea of allocated efficiency and taking a little bit, a more in-depth look into it. So the next thing we're going to talk about is once we have this economy-wide production possibilities curve, what's going to change it, right? And what implications will these changes have? So let's say we've just got two goods, X and Y. What's going to cause our production possibilities curve? Remember, this is the different combinations we are able to produce. Well, what's going to shift this curve outward, right, are things like technology changes, right? Population growth, changes in productivity. So if my workers are becoming more productive, even with the same raw materials or scarce resources, I can now produce more of either good that I'm putting my labor hours towards. If I have more people, I can, whatever I'm choosing to produce more of it. If I have a technology change, it's essentially a productivity change, right? If all of a sudden my economy has access to personal computers, my same number of labor hours can now produce more of whatever good I put my labor hours towards. So this kind of shift outward is going to represent, right, that we have something that's changing in our economy. These are kind of three of our most common examples. That's allowing for us to produce more of whatever good we choose to produce. Now, that's true whether or not the marginal cost of production have changed at all, right? If you think about like the population growth is the easiest example. The marginal cost, I might have, the first person producing it still has the same cost to produce it. It's just that I now have more people in my economy. So if I'm only producing Y, I can produce more. If I'm only producing X, I can produce more, right? So these are going to be things that impact the production of both goods the same. Will kind of cause these shifts out, okay? Any questions on that? I don't think that one's usually, I think, a little bit easier. Now, I sometimes will get this question at this point. Well, what would cause it to shift downward? Well, there's not a lot of things that we see generally. Our ability to produce has across time only increased. Although, you know, if I'm a country that finds myself entangled in a military dispute or a war, potentially what would happen to my population? What would happen to some of the productivity of my workers? Well, some of them uh, are going to be killed or may I might see something like that after that war. Maybe I do see like a downward shift in my production possibilities curve. But in general, we see that production, things that are changing generally are kind of pushing that outward. But it is technically possible, right? So what if instead I chose two goods here, a technology good and an agricultural good, right? So let's say I have a recent technology advancement and it's a tech advancement. It really doesn't have any impact on harvesting wheat, but it has a huge impact on the factories, the production process of this technology good iPhones, right? So now I have a technology change that only impacts one of these goods, right? What's going to happen? So hopefully we can see this here. There we go. Oh, well, this should work. So if I've got wheat, and I had what? iPhones up here. Grab the marker that's a little bit thicker, so we'll grab this one to make it easier. So let's say I had initially, here's my production possibilities curve. If this technology change doesn't impact wheat production at all, if I use all of my resources to produce wheat, I can still produce the exact same amount. However, because this technology change impacted iPhones, if I use all of my resources to produce iPhones, I could now produce more. And now any combination in the middle, you'll notice if I wanted to get the exact same amount of wheat, what's going to be true? So whatever this quantity is, before I could only get, kind of think about this as like the initial quantity. Now of iPhones, I can get even more. So with a technology change to one good, if I want to keep producing the same of the good that was impacted, I can now have that amount, but more of this good that had the technology change. What's also going to happen, and I try to draw this to scale so it's maybe you can hopefully see this. So I'll use black here. So what's the slope if I try to draw a line tangent to that point, and then I try to draw a line, well, it's not great here. I'll give you a more extreme one. This is where my drawing skills, sometimes I probably should use a ruler. So let's do something like this, and let's do here. So same shift, right? We had wheat and iPhones here. So at this same quantity, oh, here was my slope before. Here is my slope after, right? What's happening to my slope, right? It's becoming a little bit steeper, right? If my slope is becoming steeper for the same quantity of wheat, what's happening to the cost of that x-axis good? My slope is steeper, that cost is going up, right? Right, a flatter curve is closer to zero, right? So a steeper curve is going to be a higher cost. So it kind of makes sense. If all of a sudden now my populace is more productive at producing iPhones, well, then to produce one more unit of wheat, I'm going to have to give up more iPhone production than I was before, right? So this kind of goes to show if I have a technology change in a specific good, for the other good, it's going to increase the cost, right? Now, for the good that experienced the technology change, well, what's the cost of my y-axis good? Remember, cost of iPhones here, our y-axis good, is going to be equal to 1 over the cost of wheat, or 1 over the cost of our x-axis good. So if this denominator, cost of wheat, we said is going up, what's happening to this fraction? It's actually going down. So when we have a technology change that allows our populace to be more productive at producing a specific good, the cost to that good would fall. And then the cost of producing the other good will go up. Okay? And we can directly get that from what we've talked about with that production possibilities curve. Any questions or clarifying anyone wants on that? Okay. All right. So, got the slides. We'll kind of show you a similar thing, right? But basically, whatever good experiences that technology change, its intercept will go up. The unimpacted good stays exactly the same. Right? So you can kind of see, like at every point, this curve is becoming steeper, which implies what we said. It implies that the cost of that x-axis good is actually going up, right? A steeper slope. The slope is the cost of our x-axis good. Okay. So yeah, I was gonna say, I think I'll do something else before we get here. So just to make sure we're understanding how all of this ties together, right? And I think what I want is something like this. Okay. So whatever good that we have, X or Y, let's think about the allocative efficient point that we would want to choose, right? So here I've got my production possibilities curve. This is where I was initially starting out. We said the slope represents the cost, so I could map these values out to be our initial marginal costs, right? And then if we had some marginal benefits to that X good, we could draw those in. Where's the allocative efficient point? We would produce up to the point where marginal benefits are greater than marginal costs. This was kind of what we had earlier. Now, if I have this technology change and it impacts the production of that Y good, we said, what's going to happen to the cost at every single unit for good X? The cost, the slope is now, steeper, so the cost has went up, right? A steeper slope is a higher cost. So that means that at every single quantity, the marginal cost is now higher. So my marginal costs after this technology change for the other good that didn't experience it, they'll now have higher costs. So where is the allocated efficient point now? It's going to be a little bit lower. And intuitively, that makes sense. If this good is now more costly to make, am I going to want to continue to produce the same amount of it as before? Well, no. The marginal benefits have stayed the same. The marginal cost being higher, I'm going to want to produce less of that good. Right? Which inherently, if I'm producing less of X, what am I producing more of? I'm taking some of my resources and using them to produce good Y. Because if I drew this same thing out, let's see if I can keep, there we go. If I were to draw the production possibilities curve out for good Y, well, what would happen there? I would have some marginal benefits, right? I would have whatever the marginal cost to good Y was. But we said if the technology change impacts good Y, the slope tells me the cost of the x-axis good. The cost of the y-axis good is 1 over that. So we said if the slope is going up, the cost of our y-axis good is actually going down. So our marginal cost for the y-axis good would actually be lower at every single point, which would take us from the initial allocative efficient point for good y to our new allocative efficient point for good y, which would be a little bit higher. So once again, I think this lines up with intuition. When you have a change that impacts the production of only one good, that good now becomes relatively, you can almost think about it, cheaper to produce. The costs are lower, and so I'm going to want to produce more of it. Now, because I face scarce resources, producing more of this good, that means that if I don't produce it, my opportunity costs are now higher for the other good. I'm giving up more. So by producing more of my Y good, I'm going to have to give up the production of my X good, the thing that is now more costly to make. Okay. Any questions here? I know this is we're kind of throwing a bunch of concepts together here to kind of get the bigger picture. Any questions there? Okay. All right. So I'll go back here. So we can also think about this. We don't have to do specific goods. We can do this in terms of, excuse me, categories of goods. So not just iPhones and wheat, but we could do what we call capital and consumption goods. So capital goods are things that if we put money or resources towards them, they're going to kind of have future payoffs, right? So if you think about like, in the context of your everyday life, this would be like putting money into a mutual fund, right? Or an economy is investing in their infrastructure. Consumption goods are things that people consume and then they're gone. So things like food, maybe, I don't know, lumber for building houses, right? So we've got consumption goods and we have capital goods. Capital goods could also be investments that are made into research and development, things like that. Okay? It really works out to be the exact same. It's going to look like the exact same graph I just drew, but our goods are just going to be capital and consumption on the X and Y axis. So I'll draw it out. It's not anything too crazy. Right? We can think about if I'm making an investment, let's do capital goods here. It doesn't matter which way we do it, but we can do capital and consumption goods. Okay. So I can put my resources towards either one of these categories and I could figure out what my production possibilities curve is. Okay. Now there will be, so I can think about that production possibilities curve. Its slope tells me the marginal costs. There are going to be just some inherent marginal benefits that are diminishing. So this is the idea that, the first amount of money let's say we boil this down to not even be an economy, but like your individual decision making. Do you want to go out and, go to fast food places, or do you want to start putting money into mutual funds, right? There's, the first $100 you put into a mutual fund, you were probably going to use it to buy things that you're just going to end up throwing away anyways. So relatively low cost, but also that first amount of money you start saving, high marginal benefit for your future. Now, once you start saving, eventually get to a point where like first, $10,000 I have is a huge benefit to my life. By the time I have $1 million, saving another 10,000, that's not a very large marginal benefit. So these marginal benefits are still diminishing. So we could think about for an individual or for an economy, this decision between capital and consumption goods, we could find the allocative efficient point. Now, what if all of a sudden there are projects that become more, that you expect a higher, I don't want to say this, a higher return from in the future. So let's say I have a very unstable economy and I don't have any faith in my country's, my economy's stock market. I think it could just crash tomorrow. Well, then my expectation of that payoff is relatively low. If all of a sudden it's more stable, I could potentially expect, okay, well, now when I invest money into capital, the actual, benefit could be much higher. You could actually see shifts in this marginal benefit curve as well. So we talked about shifts in the production possibilities curve. You can also see shifts in the marginal benefit. Now, we're not going to talk about specifically what would do this. I'm just kind of trying to add some things that you can connect like to your everyday life. But if I could expect a higher return from these capital investments, mutual funds are now all of a sudden expected to return a higher amount than they have been in the past. Well, then maybe the allocated efficient point for how much I'm investing in the capital goods actually goes up, right? And so maybe this was like something like moving from here initially to moving to this point where I'm investing more into capital, less into consumption goods. So we think about more stable economies, what do we tend to see? They invest more into capital goods than consumption goods. If I have a very unstable economy, and I think if I put money in the stock market, that stock market might not even exist in a couple years. Marginal benefit would be relatively low. I'm going to invest a very small amount into capital goods. So we can take the same thought process and logic and apply it not to just two specific goods, but kind of groups of goods here as well. Okay. Any questions there? We're gonna keep moving. How much time do we have? Okay, 30 minutes here. We're sitting pretty good, right? So with this idea in mind of capital goods, and we might be investing into products that we think are going to have future payoffs, right? So we're thinking about marginal benefits. It's not just the marginal benefit today, but the total additional benefits from the next 20, even 100 years, if we're a country. Excuse me. So we're going to start to think about, would I maybe sacrifice some production today if it could get me even more production tomorrow, right? If I could take some money into producing widgets or whatever the good is, and widgets is just a term that I use in economics. It'd just be like if you're producing a product, it could be a table, a chair. If I take some of those resources away and don't produce as many of those today, and I invest in the capital goods, well, I have even more money to produce the same amount of chairs tomorrow, and then even more, right? So we'll start to think about economic growth. All right, so this output or the quantity I can produce is going to be a function of a lot of different things. So the amount of labor I have, we've mentioned this already, like things that shift that production possibilities curve out. We said just having more people, population growth. If I have more natural resources, if I have more oil, my country can produce a lot more, right, gasoline than a country that doesn't, right? Just a natural resource that I have available to me. Human capital and then capital, we'll kind of write in here. So capital, we think of just basically machinery, so technology that my labor can use. So different economies will have different access to different levels of capital, and increases in capital will increase how much the same number of workers, if they have better machinery, can produce more, right? If you go back 400 or 500 years, if I'm trying to produce chairs and tables, it's taking me all day as a woodworker. Now, in a factory, that same one person using their hours to produce tables, chairs, they're just pushing buttons and producing hundreds, if not thousands of chairs a day, right? So same idea, human capital. If I've got the same 24 hours from an individual, well, let's say 8 hours or 8-hour workday, how much can they produce if they have no knowledge at all? Not very much. But if I give them more knowledge, right, on how to produce this specific thing, so a lot of times you'll see human capital referred to as like degrees. It doesn't have to be, right? Human capital could be the knowledge of how to work on automobiles, right? And if I have more knowledge of how to work on automobiles, I can fix way more cars using the same number of labor hours than I was before. So output is going to be a function of all of these different things. And really, I listed 4 here. You could break these down into subcategories. You could argue, that, just to kind of differentiate between even skilled and unskilled labor, right? Maybe these are, IQ differences or something like that. And then generally we have kind of A is going to represent the level of technology that we have, right? So it's going to be like kind of a multiplying factor. So we won't, I'm not going to dive into this. This is a little bit more mathematical than we'll even look at throughout the semester. But really, output is just a function of all of these different things. So as I increase these different inputs, I'm going to increase the amount of output I can get. And then if all of a sudden I experience a technology change that impacts the production of everything, that's going to scale up. If I keep using the same amount of capital, labor, natural resources, this new technology will allow that same amount of initial resources to produce even more. Okay. So how are we going to kind of think about this? So this is probably about as macro as we'll get throughout the semester, but the macroeconomic production possibilities curve, right, is thinking about as I invest more into capital, right? So investing more into capital or even human capital, it's going to have impacts on the total output my workers can have, right? If I give them better machinery, I give them more knowledge through even things like education, the same number of hours or the same hour worked can get more output. So as I invest more into these capital products, that same 1 hour worked is going to result in higher and higher levels of output or higher and higher levels of production. So you'll notice here, right, the initial investment of 100 units or $100, sorry, $100 into capital, I would get 500 units from an hour worked from my populace. Now, what is that really representing? That's really just the slope here, right? It's that change, how many, or sorry, it's not representing the slope, but I can use those values to calculate the slope. So output went up by 500 for those first $100 invested. So each dollar was getting me 5 units, right? Now, the next $100 I invest, what's the additional output I get? So if I look at going from 100 to 200, well, the total output is 900, right? But the additional output, I was going from 5 to 900, I was only getting 400 for those $100 invested. My marginal output there is only going to be 4. And then if I invest the next 100, right? I'm going from 900 to 1200. I'm only getting 300 additional units for those 100. So I'm only getting a marginal output of, oh, I didn't have it as a bullet point, but 3. So as I start to invest more and more into these capital products, what's happening to the additional output I'm getting? It's going down or it's diminishing. Same kind of ideas like the marginal benefit, right? We have diminishing marginal benefits. Output is a benefit to the economy. So the additional output or the additional benefits is diminishing. Okay. Hold on, I got people talking out here on me. I'll start shutting the door. I don't know if you could hear it, and I didn't want it to be distracting. So it was distracting me, I guess. So I didn't want to be distracting you. Now, where does this come from? Like this idea that, why is the marginal output diminishing? Well, what projects, if I think about this from an economy standpoint or even a firm standpoint, the first $100 I take away from consumption goods and put towards capital goods or investment, projects, what project am I going to invest in first? The one that I think is going to be the most effective or have the largest increase in my output. Then if I want to invest even more, the next $100, I'll choose the second most profitable or the second most beneficial project. So as I invest more money, I'm investing in less and less efficient projects. I can kind of think about it that way, right? If I want to think about it from like a firm standpoint. For an economy, I'm just investing in things that I think are going to have, smaller and smaller impacts on my overall production level. Okay. So this law of diminishing returns, it's now kind of popped up twice in relationship to this macroeconomic production possibilities curve, but also just in the consumption of any good. And we'll see it pop back up in module 3 as well. So we'll be using this a lot throughout the semester. We're assuming, that we have this law of diminishing returns when it comes to our benefits. And here output is the benefit. Okay. So any questions on that idea before we keep moving? So I said before, you could think about when we had that decision between consumption and capital goods. From the production possibilities curve, we were getting the marginal costs. from this macroeconomic production possibilities curve, we are getting the marginal benefit of capital, right? So if I think about the optimal level of capital, oh, I moved it down here. So let's go to stop share. So remember, we were getting these marginal costs from our original production possibilities curve. Where were these marginal benefits coming from? So I had an example earlier where they were increasing, but I'll kind of try to draw this out. I think will be helpful to connect the dots a little bit more. So let's say I've got the amount I'm investing in capital, and here I had the resulting output that it was leading to. And then over here, I've got how much capital I'm investing, and I'm trying to understand where the allocated efficient point is. So I had those marginal costs before, just from my regular production possibilities curve. This new macroeconomic production possibilities curve was telling me that, okay, the slope is representing the additional output or my marginal benefits. So what's happening to the slope? It's decreasing. So we had these diminishing marginal benefits. And here was our initial allocative efficient point in terms of the investment into capital goods, where the marginal benefit was exactly equal to the marginal cost of the last dollar invested. If all of a sudden we see something that will make the same amount of money invested into capital lead to even greater amounts of output. So this would be something like I have a technology change. So I'm investing the same amount into these projects, but now with this new technology, the same amount invested, I'm not just getting the level of output I was before, I'm getting even more. And out here, I'm getting even more. What's happening to my macroeconomic production possibilities curve? Well, at every point, it's increasing. So notice what's happening at every point to my slope. It's going up. What does the slope represent? It's the additional output, or we can kind of think about it as the marginal output or the marginal benefit. So technology changes, while they will also impact marginal cost potentially, we also can think about, even if they didn't impact the overall production of the goods we're looking at, and they were just impacting our capital goods, here what's happening, we're seeing that the marginal benefit's going up. So what's happening to how much we invest into these capital goods, it would also be going up. And once again, it's kind of intuitive. If I know that projects are going to be more profitable or kind of lead to higher levels of additional output in the future, I'm going to invest more in them. Once again, this is thinking about an economy, but you can think about your own life. You have your own economy, right? Your individual economy. If there's capital products out there, mutual funds or whatever the investment is, and you all of a sudden think you can get a higher rate of return, what are you going to do? You're going to want to put more money into whatever capital good product that is. This could even be broken down to like different types of stocks. If you believe all of a sudden that there's some technology change that's going to impact one sector but not the others, what do you want to do? Invest more into that capital good for whatever sector you think has that technology change. Okay. Is this hopefully, once again, it's weird not getting as many questions in these summer classes. So any questions on anything before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So I kind of already mentioned this, but if we do have something, this technology change, that even investing the same amount into capital would increase the amount of output we get, right? We said that like at every point, we have a higher level of output than we did before. We talked about the slope differences, how that could lead to different allocated efficient points. So this is just kind of, I drew this out for us, but you also have a slide to kind of go back to think about how that technology change would increase that macroeconomic production possibilities curve. All right, so I think this stuff gets to be kind of fun here. So I'll show you all of this first, and then I'll kind of jump into Excel. So this is an important thing for understanding growth rates for economies. I'll also try to put this in the context how it might benefit your life. So if I want to know, so GDP, gross domestic product, and we would talk more about this in B252, but it's a general overall measure of how much an economy is producing. So you can think about it as output, right? This overall Q, this quantity, this production. Well, if I take my current GDP, right, my current production, if I am investing some amount of money into capital products, that's hopefully going to lead to more available resources in the future. So I should have some growth rate that's caused by that. Okay. So what my new GDP will be is whatever my original gross domestic product was, times 1 plus this growth rate, which will be in decimal form. So 5% growth rate would be 0.05. Take that to the power of the number of years that you're trying to project out what growth would be, and that would give you your new GDP. Okay. So a general rule of thumb is every 70 years, right? Sorry, every 70 years. How many years would it take for your GDP to double? 70 over whatever your growth rate is. So for example, if this was what, I don't know, your growth rate was 7%, and here, just to be clear, so up here, this is growth rate, and you would mathematically use this in decimal form. And then down here, for the rule of thumb, it's percentage. And I won't try to trick you with a question on this. If I ask you a question, you'll kind of see from those practice problems, it's going to be using this formula. But down here, the rule of 70, if I had a growth rate of 7%, that would be 70 over 7. It would take my GDP about what, 10 years to double. If the growth rate was 10%, it would take it, sorry, I don't know if I misspoke. Growth rate of 7, 10 years to double. Growth rate of 10, 7 years to double. Growth rate of, I don't know, what, 5% would be, what, 12, 14 years to double, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So never underestimate the power of compound interest. So why do I have this kind of there? I've got this Excel example that I want to show you that will kind of show us the implications here. So I actually also have, to kind of set us up, under the file, hold on, I don't need to go to files. It's in the files tab, but I also put it on the home page. We have this S&P returns. Right? So I think this was like it's kind of older, but it's, if you look over any 10-year stretch of the S&P 500, on average, you're getting like what, 10% return, right? So let's think about, I have this table in here, but we can use Excel to be our calculator. So if I've got my growth rate, and I'm telling you that on average, if you were today, let's say you're starting out, you're an incoming freshman, okay? So let's say the current growth rate, on average is 10% for that stock market. We're going to enter it in. So we've got as 0.1, right? So this would represent 10%. Let's say everybody has a different amount of money available to them. So here we're going to say, well, what's the amount that I'm investing? Well, maybe I don't know. I got a, what are they? Graduation party. I don't know how much money people are making these days. I didn't get very much, but let's just say, I don't know, you got like $1,000 from everybody, from all the cards and giving you money, right? Or you have $1,000 laying around that you're thinking about investing into the stock market. If you then want to project, okay, if I keep this in the stock market for those 4 years I'm in college, how much money am I going to have when everything's said and done, right? So, what would my total payout be at the end? Well, really, we can use that equation, right, that we had for GDP. Our GDP is just the amount invested times 1 plus whatever that growth rate is. Here we're using 10%. And then in Excel, this is how you would do to the power. I don't know how familiar everyone is with Excel, but you can do this on a calculator just using that power button. We're going to take it to the power of however many years, right? So if you invest $1,000 at 10% growth rate over 4 years, how much money am I making? Well, the total payout is $1,400. So you kind of think about, I don't know, the amount of money made would be the total payout minus the amount I invested. So if you could find something that's returning 10%, guaranteed over those 4 years, pretty good investment, right? Now, probably hard to do that. If you have things like CDs, actually, what's the, we can look it up real quick. Oh, so they're like, 5%-ish. So CDs are like guaranteed. I don't know, you guys are how far you are into your Kelly career, but the thing about different financial products that if you end up in finance, you could be selling for a bank. Maybe I have 5.5% or 0.055. I can still make $238, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's almost for only 4 years, right? $1,000 invested, that's a pretty good payout, right? And then I could break it down. Well, what if I kept it in there for 10 years? Oh, I'm making 700, right? What if I only invest it into one? Not as much, but $55, it's $55. If I wasn't going to do anything with that $1,000 anyways, and it was going to sit in a bank account and earn hardly any interest, well, I can, make quite a bit. So, I also think hopefully this goes to show, like, let's say I went from a growth rate of 2%, I'm making $82 in 4 years, to 0.04, 4%. I'm going from 82 to 169, so more than doubling. 0.06, that's even more than tripling, right? So as you start to kind of have these higher and higher interest rates, that compounding interest really, really makes a difference. In fact, if I had something like 0.02, doesn't, or actually, no, we'll go back to the 1%. Let's say it was 1%. If I can keep this in there a long time, it ends up being $200 over. Now, obviously, then my money's tied up, but this hopefully goes to show that even at relatively low growth rates, the longer we can kind of keep that investment there, the payout's going to be much larger. So for an economy, even if I have a moderate growth rate over the next 100 years, that should result in a pretty large increase in my overall GDP. So what can I impact? Well, I can try to do things that impact what my current GDP is. And I can also try to find areas where the amount invested will have the highest growth rate. Okay. I also have this sheet that, I don't know, if any of you are interested, you can reach out to me. I think it's kind of interesting to build things like that, build things like this. But I have some knowledge of Excel, and there's some things that we won't dive into because I'm not going to expect you to know. But I think this is just kind of a nice little easy way to show, like, even if I invested $1, and here I've got some different interest rates or growth rates over time. So I did 1 to 35 years. Notice, if that $1, I'm not making a whole lot of money if I only keep it in there for a year. But even $1 invested, if I can get a growth rate like in the stock market of 10%, in 35 years, that's $28. That's a, you know, it's what, 2,800% return, right? So if I took that $1,000 from my graduation, so I'm not going to touch this for another 35 years. 35 years from now, that's what? $14,000? So this kind of or actually, no, I looked at the wrong column. $28,000, right? Not 14,000. So, I don't know. You could play around with this if you're thinking about making some investments. You could change the growth interest rates. You could make more columns here. You could look at shorter time frames. Yeah. All right. So hopefully you found that somewhat interesting. Like I said, I'm trying to take some things that are a little bit more, economic based and kind of apply them more to your everyday life, but also things that you might see pop up in your finance classes or other courses you take here while you're at IU. And that should do it for module 2. So any questions on that? Anything in module 2 that anyone had questions on? So what have we not done yet? And maybe we won't have a time to kind of start module 3. That shouldn't matter. We should cover it by the end of the week, no problem. But we haven't looked at the questions for this module quiz participation quiz. Looking at the module quiz as I selected it. So let's look here. Try to work through these in the next 10 minutes. So suppose we have an economy and they can produce 2 different types of goods, coal or nuclear power. If there's a technology advancement that impacts nuclear power but not coal power, coal power. If nuclear power is on the x-axis, the production possibility curve will experience which of the following? Okay. So this is where if we've got coal and nuclear power, and let me see, let me make sure. So we said nuclear power is on the x-axis here. So we could think about this as quantity of nuclear power, quantity of coal power. Right? Initially, we've got some production possibilities curve. If we have a technology change that impacts nuclear power but not coal power, what's going to happen? Well, if we use all of our resources to produce coal, it's going to be right here. All of our resources to produce nuclear power out here. So we're not getting a parallel shift out in our production possibilities curve. We're only seeing it shift out on this x-axis. Now, as it shifts out on this x-axis, what's happening to kind of like if I was looking at any one point, what's happening to my slope? It's getting flatter. So a flatter slope, that's the cost of my x-axis good. So if I'm getting a flatter slope, the cost of my x-axis good is getting closer to 0 or going down. So nuclear power there is becoming less costly, essentially. Okay. So we've got what? It's going to become flatter, or that x-axis good is becoming less costly. Okay. Any questions on that one? Okay. Here, I've only got 2 questions today. So after a technology improvement, investing the same amount into capital per worker would result in what blank output per worker? Excuse me. And the country or firm experiencing this technology change will be more or less likely to have a comparative advantage. Okay. So here, if I'm thinking about capital investment and output per worker, I should be thinking about my macroeconomic production possibilities curve. So we said, oops, there we go. Make sure I'm reading this right. Capital per worker, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So before, got capital, we had our output that was resulting from that investment. And kind of here was that relationship between the two. So after a technology change, we said, what's going to happen? The same amount of investment at every point, it's now going to result in more output. So I'm going to have this increase in my macroeconomic production possibilities curve. So the first question, which was, if I invest the same amount of capital, what's going to happen to the output I get per worker? And I should be a little bit careful. This was output per worker here. Well, it's going to go up, right? Now, the second question was, is this country more or less likely to now have a comparative advantage? Right? What was it? Are they more likely to have a comparative advantage? So if I'm making this investment in the capital, my workers are becoming, and I kind of see this increase in the overall output per worker if I keep the same amount of investment in the capital the same. Well, this technology change, in order to understand comparative advantages, we don't need to know the additional benefits that exist. We need to know what? We needed to know, oh, whatever these goods are. Sorry. Oh, you guys, can you see this? Hold on. I'm down here. There we go. So once we have this technology advancement, whatever good it impacts, right, we should see that I can now produce more of that good. So I'll just choose Y. Let's kind of make this make a little more sense here. So this will make that, sorry, this will make it a little bit trickier, but I want to do this for a reason. So what's happening if I had this technology advancement and good Y? What's happening to my costs for good Y? Well, the slope tells me the cost of good X, right? So what's happening to the cost of the X-axis good? If my slope is going up, it's getting steeper. That means that I have higher costs, right? But remember, the cost of my y-axis good is 1 over the cost of that x-axis good. So if the cost of the x-axis good is going up, when the denominator is larger, the overall cost of my y-axis good would be going down. So whatever good I experience that technology change in, if my costs are lower for that good, it's going to be more likely that I have a comparative advantage. Okay. So I should be able to get an increase in my output per worker, and I will be more likely to have a comparative advantage in that product. Okay. So this one was kind of combining two different graphs, two different concepts into one question. Likely wouldn't probably do something like that per se. This specific question on an exam, you'll kind of see with the quiz, you'll see kind of in the practice problems how better representation of how I might separate this into two separate questions so that you're only looking at the macroeconomic production possibilities curve in one question, and you're only looking at kind of our standard production possibilities curve, the decision between the production of two goods in another. Okay. So hopefully we're good to go. So we had what? Auto grading on. Oh, I probably shouldn't have submitted that. Just show you. There we go. So it becomes flatter, and then we set an increase, which then also lowers the cost, making it more likely to have a comparative advantage. Okay. All right. Any questions on anything? We'll kind of, like I said, we won't dive into module 3 here today. You'll have that module 3 reading due before we start class tomorrow. Participation quiz, once again, a lot of you I'm not speaking to because you're here live, but if you're watching these recordings after the fact, kind of have it set up so you can kind of work on this course a little bit more week by week or 2 or 3 days at a time. So those participation quizzes due by the end of the day, Sunday. Okay. And then we finish module 2. So that quiz will now be available. Once again, that's also due at the end of the day, Sunday. Now, getting it out of the way sooner rather than later, I suggest doing that. Don't feel like you have to do it today. If you want to take some time to review those practice problems, which this module not only has the answer key, but also has a solutions file associated with it to kind of show you kind of how this would be worked out. I would highly suggest going through these and making sure you feel comfortable with these before starting that quiz. Okay. All right. Other than that, any other questions for me? See if anything pops up in the chat. Otherwise, we'll kind of end it here. All right. So get that module 3 reading done before tomorrow's class, and I will see you tomorrow.